Ratchet and Clank Future Tools of Destruction is a change we never needed. On the surface, it looks like the classic PS2 entries. The weapon nanotech upgrade system makes a return, the contrasting personalities of Ratchet and Clank bounce off one another. Maybe it could be seen as a slight improvement with the HD graphics and a deeper story. However, even with all that, Tools of Destruction always felt like it was missing something. It was as if a certain charm from the originals was taken away. You see, Tools of Destruction innovates in areas that never needed improvement. Perhaps in an attempt to build off on how this is the first game of a next-gen console, Insomniac tried to change the focus of the story. No longer was it about saving the galaxy with a touch of humor. Now, it was more about Ratchet trying to learn about his past. The result was a narrative that doesn't quite fit with what its predecessor set up, and at times felt like a tonal whiplash. At the same time, it plays it safe in areas that could have used changes. Ratchet 2 and 3 evolved the gameplay to the point that each felt distinct. I can't say the same for Tools. Maybe there were a couple of things they tweaked, but these at best didn't affect the gameplay and at worst made it feel like a less refined version of its predecessors. Granted, maybe after the heights that Insomniac established for themselves with Deadlocked and Up Your Arsenal, perhaps there was nowhere to go but down. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that Tools of Destruction is a bad game, but the more I play it, the more I see the hidden cracks beneath its polished surface. So, let's start with the story, since that's the area that seems to have gone through the most amount of changes. So the game opens with our titular heroes on planet Kurwan. The duo is trying to repair a speeder bike when suddenly Captain Quark calls them. He urgently asks them to intervene in a massive invasion of heavily armed robotic commandos. So, Ratchet and Clank arrive to suppress it, only for them to be introduced to the culprit of the attack, known as Emperor Percival Tachyon. The duo manages to escape using his ship and venture around the Polaris galaxy, learning that Tachyon forces all of its civilians to bend down under his iron rule. He particularly has a hatred for Lombaxes. Later on, Ratchet and Clank uncover that Tachyon is seeking out the Lombax secret. Meeting their new allies in Talman, Kronk, and Zephyr, Ratchet must travel across the galaxy to uncover the secret before Tachyon does, all the while learning about his past. Meanwhile, Clank's experiencing weird visions from strange creatures known as the Zoni. The thing is, he's the only one who can see them, so this creates a strain in his relationship with Ratchet. So, if you couldn't already tell, Tools of Destruction has a lot more going on in it. Recognizing this as the part where I tear the game apart, let's start with some positives. There were a couple of scenes that were impactful, like when Ratchet is tempted to rejoin the Lombaxes and he chooses against it, showing how much his friends mean to him, or when both Ratchet and Clank reunite after being separated and reconcile after spending a good chunk of the game arguing. All the old voice actors return, and their line delivery is great. And, to be honest, that's pretty much it. Alright, mask off. This story really wasn't developed well. First of all, there's the whole relationship concerning the Lombaxes and interdimensional travel. What made them want to build something like the Dimensionator? Was there a reason they decided to simply move to Kragmites instead of outright destroying them? Even with some of the optional dialogue, there are a lot of vague details about the Great War and the culture of the Lombaxes. The game also has some serious plot holes. Why is it that only Clank can see the Zoni but not Ratchet? This never really gets explained, and it only feels like a plot point Insomniac shoved in so that Ratchet could argue more with Clank. How do the Zoni know so much about the Kragmites? And why did they specifically choose to come to Clank? I guess this all gets explained in a crack in time, because it turns out he's like this chosen one, but the way Tools handles it, it gives some weird religious undertones. Like, I'm sure Ratchet just needs an ounce of faith in order to see the Zoni, but in all seriousness, Ratchet and Clank isn't a series to talk about religion of all things, and yet, here it is, with Ratchet being the atheist and Clank being the theist.
It broke new ground!
Moving on to the next plot hole, why did Tachyon wait so long to go after Ratchet? In fact, it seems like he's a very well-known figure within places like the Polaris galaxy. How come he didn't get a mention in previous games? He states he knows Ratchet's true name, so what? Ratchet isn't Ratchet?
Questions. You ask all these questions.
Yeah, basically you can tell Insomniac made this up as they went along. The fact that Ratchet is the last of his kind is thrown in our face like a truck driving straight into a house. It was never hinted at, and the audience didn't really have much of a reason to care. And this shift in narrative also takes away some of the more nuanced elements that made the previous Ratchet and Clanks so grounded. The satirical criticisms of consumerist culture is no longer present. Instead, this game tries to be more epic with the inclusion of pirates, and they don't really serve much of a purpose. Apparently, Tachyon built them, but you'll never know this unless you listen to the song lyrics they sing in-game. With that, the lovable NPCs are also removed. And now you've got this unlikable, sleazy smuggler with his annoying talking parrot. Perhaps Insomniac thought that the themes about consumerism and such were going over to kiddos' heads, and that they needed something simpler in scope. And speaking of which, the humor is really watered down compared to what it once was. Remember cross-dressing Quark from Up Your Arsenal? Remember when Angela swore? All that has been replaced with underwear jokes.
Stunderwear. Huge seller in numbers.
Or Tachyon's hat being too big for him. The kiddie humor clashes a lot with the serious tone the game was going for. There's this one scene where it seems like all hope is lost and Tachyon has won. He's about to use the Lombax secret to bring back the Kragmites, which would destroy the universe. However, despite this dark moment, the game just had to make a joke about how Tachyon couldn't get the Dimensionator to actually work. Does this look like a threatening villain to you? Scenes like this make me have trouble figuring out what this game is going for. It wants to be deeper than the original 4 games, but it also has these unfunny jokes. In one sense, it makes it even more juvenile than before. And can I just rant about how god-awful a villain Emperor Tachyon is? Throughout most of the game, we hear about the things he's going to do, but we never actually see him do it. For instance, when he's announcing how he plans on stealing the Lombax secret, he says he wants to do it by attacking the Apogee space station.
Our spies have learned that the secret may be hidden here on this remote moon base. If you sign up by tonight, you can join in on the raid.
However, when we actually visit there, Tachyon's troops are nowhere to be found. Why did he mention joining him on the raid when he doesn't actually do it? And even the things he does do, like capture Tallman, Kronk, and Zephyr, it doesn't have a lot of impact. He kidnaps them off-screen, so we don't actually see it. And he had the audacity of letting Tallman keep her gun while she was in her cell. That just spells incompetence all over. And yeah, releasing the Kragmites sounds plain evil, but all they do is attack Meridian City. Now this would have been impactful if we saw the citizens screaming for their lives, but do they do that? But somebody could argue that Tachyon did the ultimate evil by killing Ratchet's father and driving the Lombaxes into exile. But, once again, we only hear he did this. And let me just say, he's pretty weak compared to previous Ratchet and Clank villains. I guess Tachyon can be compared to Dr. Nefarious, since he's the only other villain in the PS2 entries that didn't have a connection to the consumerist culture themes. However, Dr. Nefarious was at least really funny, and we get to see him pose a threat to the galaxy. Tachyon, in comparison, is a total oaf and just goes around screaming when mad, and he has this ear-grating high-pitched voice that sounds like Dr. Nefarious breathed in too much helium. Like, seriously? This is the guy who wiped out Ratchet's race? But it doesn't end there. Insomniac also found a way to screw over the love interest. Or supposed love interest, since Ratchet doesn't have a romance with Tallman. Usually the female deuteragonists are a hit or miss. Angela is probably the best one, since she's integral to dismantling the Proto-Pet conspiracy. Sasha, on the other hand, didn't do much and was a little bit lacking in some areas, so Tallman was the answer to her problems. Insomniac tried to add some character to her by providing her with a backstory. Basically, her father is a renowned explorer named Max Apogee who went out searching for the Lombax secret. However, after a raid from some pirates, he never came back. The issue lies with the fact this never resurfaces again except through optional dialogue. Like, contrast that with Angela, whose ties to Megacorp actually led to the gang stopping the Proto-Pet invasion. Even in Up Your Arsenal, Sasha had a hand in the resistance effort against Nefarious through her status as the President's daughter. Talwyn's backstory just feels like it's there to make her look more sympathetic. Which is ironic since sympathetic is the last word I'd use to describe her. She shows herself to be kind of mean-spirited in the way she demeans Ratchet for not knowing anything about the Lombaxes. She's also really stubborn to ask for help, as seen with how reluctant she is to take it when Ratchet offers. Yeah, she's a girl boss. I get it, but could you make her a more developed and likable girl boss? And don't get me started on those two twits, Kronk and Zephyr. These are two of the unfunniest characters I've ever seen. They're probably the best examples of the childish humor getting in the way of the serious tone. When Ratchet presumes Clank to be dead on Planet Reaper, he and Talman are in mourning. But what are Kronk and Zephyr doing? They're trying to find a way to reattach Kronk's decapitated head. This scene is supposed to be sad. Ratchet thinks his best friend is dead. How am I supposed to feel anything if there are jokes like this? So the new characters are nothing burgers, and worst of all, they didn't bother bringing back any of the old ones like Helga or Al. Where are they? Why couldn't they bring back those guys instead of trying to force these strangers upon us? Can I mention how bad it feels that Captain Quark is dumbed down? He had this redemption arc in Up Your Arsenal. Here he goes back to being a cowardly wuss. Remember how epic it was when he flew in to stop Dr. Nefarious? Yeah, what happened to that guy? Finally, there's the music. Now this is a bit of a hit or miss. The OST abandons the techie sci-fi feel of the originals in favor for orchestral cinematic scores. In some areas it works. The Pirates theme has this one section that feels like it was ripped straight out of Pirates of the Caribbean. And the theme for Kurwan is also memorable. This is the first thing you see and hear in the game, so for the soundtrack to introduce this banger to represent the intensity of the Metropolis attack really hooks me in. However, for all the other tracks, they're mostly forgettable. Despite David Bergeau composing this, it doesn't sound like Ratchet and Clank. Maybe it sounds like I'm engaging in the it's different and therefore ruined argument, but there was no need to change the music. The techie OST was what gave the series its unique identity, and for the franchise to lose that makes it feel like Insomniac was trying to adopt a certain trend. So having said all that, you guys probably think that I absolutely hate the living fuck out of Ratchet and Clank Future Tools of Destruction. But I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't having fun while playing it. Yes, the changes they made are a bit off-putting, but at the same time, it's the same old Ratchet and Clank gameplay. Granted, there are some aspects that take away from what made the PS2 experience so good. Throughout each planet, you'll be blasting your way through enemies with the arsenal of creative weapons you wield, and Tools of Destruction has a very decent selection. However, it's a step back from past entries. Your starting weapon, the Combuster, is the worst blaster the series has to offer. It fires really slowly, and I never feel the impact of my shots as they hit my enemies. As a side note, the controls in general feel a bit slower, from firing your weapon to Ratchet's jumping animation. It's not a big problem, but it does feel less fluid compared to the originals. This is also the game that introduces devices to the mix, and I wasn't a big fan of these, mainly because I couldn't upgrade them like my regular weapons. There were some situations where they were really useful. The Grievatron was fun to play around with, considering that it was interesting to see what different dance moves the characters pulled off. The Leech Bomb was also useful to regain a bit of health in tight situations. Other than that, most of these just took away experience from my weapons. And speaking of which, the experience level up system has undergone a bit of a change. Now the game gives the option to manually upgrade them with Raritanium. While there's still the option to upgrade through experience, it's no longer as viable, as the only thing that increases is the damage output. Basically, if you want to level up your rate of fire, area effect, or get bonus modifications, you have to do it through finding Raritanium. This renders the nanotech experience system somewhat inefficient because it doesn't do much to evolve the weapons at hand. But where it still manages to find some success is its arsenal. Pushing aside the lame guns like the Combustor, Tools of Destruction introduces some of the most creative weapons the series has ever seen. The Tornado Launcher and Shard Reaper are both very unique in their own way. The latter is technically the shotgun of the game, however, it's different from the others because it unleashes a flurry of spikes onto unsuspecting foes, which explode if upgraded with Raritanium. The Tornado Launcher is also useful because it absorbs a lot of enemies in its path. However, the 6-axis made it really hard to use, as sometimes the tornado had a mind of its own and wouldn't follow my inputs. The 6-axis is used a lot in this game, and thankfully you can turn it off because it's insufferable to handle. However, the Tornado Launcher makes it mandatory, so it was very frustrating to control. The Buzzblades are like a more advanced disc blade launcher with a faster rate of fire. Despite its low damage output, its ability to ricochet off enemies and rapid fire make up for its shortcomings. It's probably the most fun weapon in the game. The Alpha Disruptor is an overpowered quantum cannon in the sense that it launches a laser blast that can kill an enemy in 1 or 2 shots. Insomniac managed to balance this by giving it a low ammo amount, so it's not broken or anything. The Razor Claws are a spectacle because they deviate from the more ranged weapons. The really cool gimmick with these is that they grow more powerful with each successive hit. However, if you take damage, they lose all their strength. This creates a challenge, since you have to avoid enemy attacks at all costs when wielding these. The irony is that because the Razor Claws make you dash closer to your foes, you're almost guaranteed to take damage. They're cool in concept, but not good when it comes to their execution. I recommend using the magnet launcher with these, since the electric net would paralyze them, allowing you to squeeze some hits in. But despite these issues, it's a very decent roster of weapons. Sadly, it doesn't do much to mitigate the difficulty in this game. The enemy scaling is atrocious. From what I can tell, their attacks scale up to your health, so a lot of the enemies literally killed me in 2 or 3 hits. The problem is that the stronger sets of armor are so expensive to buy, so you really have to go out of your way to grind bolts to purchase these. It's not impossible to progress without the Terraflux armor, but it does get really annoying having to repeat the same parts over and over again because I was killed by a cheap shot. What makes this even more frustrating is this game's unforgiving checkpoint system. Take the Kirchu boss fight as an example. Every time you die, you have to redo this stupid grind rail section. And this isn't like the quick gyrocycle part into Oobleck Passage. This is a long, plodding rail grinding part that just grinds my fucking gears. Holy shit, does the Kirchu boss do a lot of damage. Well, I know I'm having Kirchu for dinner. Speaking of the Oobleck Passage, there's one area where the game literally traps you inside of an arena to fight waves of pirates. The main problem are these electrified enemies. Like, they literally can just pop out of nowhere and lead to an untimely death because just touching these guys does a lot of damage. The worst part about this is that once you die, you have to fight these a-holes all over again. Basically, it forced me to proceed in this area very slowly, and considering Ratchet and Clank is a fast-paced game, that is just painful. Thankfully, not all of the levels of Tools of Destruction are that bad, and for the most part, it's pretty solid. My criticism of branching pathways from up your arsenal extends to this game, but one thing that Tools does better is that there was this sense of exploration whenever you found a secondary path. Planets that were wide open like Sargasso and Apogee Space Station mirrored the likes of Siberius and Tabora from the second game. Jacindu has this underground gelatin factory that really contrasted from the war going on in the surface. Planet Visceron has a secret warehouse that can only be accessed with the helipods, which later leads to a gold bolt. These might feel out of the way and not too impactful, but they make the levels feel bigger and it sort of gives a break from the formulaic running and gunning through a linear path. The new features also try to give breaks from the core gameplay, but usually they weren't very fun to do. The Zoni give Clank a lot of new additions. The glider is the first upgrade he gets. For the mandatory segments, you'll be flying through a pathway of rings. It's very Superman 64-esque and pure tedium. Luckily, these really spread their wings out, no pun intended, when you get to explore the open world and to do things like stand on top of a dinosaur's head or discover a gold bolt off the beaten path. He also gets this laser that can cut through walls, and it's really pointless. The main gimmick with this is the 6-axis controls, and I've already rambled how stupid these were. What would have been cool is if Clank used this laser as an attack to supplement Ratchet's weapons, but alas, it's merely used for these scripted segments. Clank's regular gameplay is much better handled, if only because it's just more of the same. Basically, the Zonies serve as the gadget bots, and Clank orders them around, the only difference being that he can now levitate, slow down time, and manipulate objects. It's more of the same, but the new commands do freshen it up a little bit. Tools of Destruction also brings back the space battles from Going Commando. This time they're an on-rail shooter, so it's just flying in a straight line and firing at targets. This is a huge step backwards compared to the more open flying levels of the second game. To give it some credit, sometimes the set pieces are impressive, like the one where you fly through a black hole while fighting a boss, but those are just small moments of fun, and one is otherwise filler. The space battles also had a lot of scripted areas. In the middle of the section, for no apparent reason, Clank gets on a turret and starts shooting away at flying ships coming from behind. I dreaded whenever Ratchet said,
Clank, hop on that turret!
Because these parts are just so unnecessary and really just ruin the pacing of the space flight. The hacking minigames make a return, and this time they come in the form of Ratchet using the decryptor. Basically, he needs to guide the charge to the endpoint by connecting gaps in the circuit. Normally, a lot of the hacking minigames aren't really a big deal, but similar to the space battles, the decryptor was a downgrade compared to what was seen before. In Up Your Arsenal, you had to differentiate between collecting the green code snippets and destroying the red defense programs, and it would really get intense sometimes. On the other hand, rolling the ball in the decryptor is slow, and you have to stand really still to bridge the circuit. It felt like the game was trying to test my patience and how steadily I can balance a ball, rather than my dexterity. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, the pirate dancing and gyrocycling. Two of the most forgettable features in the game because of how little they're used. On their own, they're functional. Pirate dancing is just following the prompts that show up, and a gyro ball is just running on a pathway while avoiding obstacles. It's just that they're only used twice. Thrice if you're counting the gold bolt segment in the Oobleck Passage. So, honestly, these are both barely worth mentioning. So, some of you might remember that I mentioned the gameplay was too safe and didn't change much. Yet, I'm talking about all these changes and new features. That's because a lot of these innovations feel as if they didn't add to the Ratchet and Clank experience in a meaningful way. Everything that makes a Ratchet and Clank game is here. The gold bolts are hidden in hard-to-find places, the skill points have obscure methods to discover them, the arena challenges provide the satisfaction of blowing shit up with your weapons. All of that is fine and dandy, but the new features are underutilized or not done very well. So yes, while it's fun, Tools of Destruction feels like any old Ratchet and Clank game. And that's a problem, especially when you look at how its predecessors really innovated the series. To sum it up, Tools of Destruction is watered-down Ratchet and Clank. Back in 2007, it was more impressive being the first game in the series to be on the PS3. Seeing Metropolis in HD was mind-blowing to say the least. Sad to say that today, a lot of that appeal is no longer there. The story took away a lot of the charm of the originals, and instead, they tried to replace it with a more dramatic tale explaining Ratchet's origin that doesn't quite fit in what was built up in the previous installments. The characters of Helga, Al, Scrunch, and Skid McMurks are no longer present, and instead replaced with banal caricatures that make unfunny jokes. While the gameplay stayed true to the old Ratchet and Clank formula, it did little to innovate, or at least a lot of the innovations felt undercooked. Basically, Tools of Destruction was the beginning of the downward slope for Ratchet and Clank. It's not as bad as what comes after, but you can see the subtle marks that worsen with titles like All for One and Full Frontal Assault. That being said, am I really ready to say that I hate Tools of Destruction? I've gotta be honest that I have a bit of a history with this title. It was my first PS3 game, and it's probably the Ratchet and Clank I played the most. Even in this playthrough, I had fun going through it again. However, Even with that being said, it doesn't reach the pedestal that the first 4 games set. It was a change that we never needed, but one that we sadly got. I'm kind of curious to see if I still like A Crack in Time, considering that game builds off the foundation of Tools. But until that day comes, I'm Dave Reviews, and I'll see you guys next time.